There is a new openness to the Holocaust on the part of the third generation. The first generation, which were the perpetrators and the victims had a difficult time for many years talking about what had happened to them. They didn't want to burden their children, and when they first began to speak, few people believed the magnitude of what they said. The perpetrators didn't want to speak because they had been defeated and their cause had been defeated. And consequently, to speak of their role and their responsibility would have been to admit guilt, and that they didn't want to do. Their children, and that is the children of the victims and the perpetrators generally, and I don't compare the two, were careful to learn what they could and what they could not ask their parents. In all parental relations, there are red lines you don't ask, you don't cross. And what we found cross-culturally is that the third generation is willing to ask questions that the second generation was unwilling to ask their parents. I spoke in Mexico with a woman by the name of Catherine Himmler. Himmler is the grandniece of Heinrich Himmler. Himmler is the grandniece of Heinrich Himmler. She wrote a truthful book about her family. She shattered the myth that Heinrich was the bad apple, but the other two brothers were wonderful. I spoke in Los Angeles with Gottfried Wagner, the great-grandson of Richard Wagner, and also the scion of the Wagner family, who wrote a truthful history about his past. We now see that grandchildren of survivors are asking their parents questions that, grandchildren of survivors are asking their grandparents questions that their own parents would refuse to ask them. So there's a new openness. In Germany, the third generation is rejecting the view that Helmut Kohl wanted, that, you know, there were a few bad Nazis and otherwise they were the good soldiers who fought the war. And the grandchildren are asking questions that make what happened at Bitburg look like something insignificant. Kohl wanted to bury that past, and the next generation wants to discover it. We also have in Germany an exhibition of the role of the Wehrmacht in the killing process, something that could not have occurred 20, 30 years ago. And part of what brings me to Bulgaria is that Bulgaria has three very different traditions that it has to grapple with. And what makes Bulgaria unique and most interesting is, on the one hand, Bulgarians were heroic rescuers of their Jews. On the other hand, they were also brutal murderers of the Jews of Thrace and Macedonia, and they had blood on their hands. And on the third hand, they were cruel persecutors of their own people. But what makes this story unique is that some people of goodwill, Peshov, for example, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, stood up when it came time to deport the Jews of Bulgaria and did not allow those deportations to go forth.
And this brings me to my last question, actually. Can you, for yourself, say, how is that possible? How is that possible, one man to be on the two sides?
What happens to many people is there is a moment that is reached in which you cannot go along with what's happening. A moment that challenges your humanity, that challenges your common decency, that challenges your integrity, that challenges everything that you stand for. Prior to the threatened deportation of the Jews of Bulgaria, we were dealing with foreigners, other people, not us, not ours. What happened for Peshov, what happened for the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, was that once we spoke of our own people, once we spoke of our own people, we passed a line that could not be crossed. So they acted too late to save some, but not too late to save all. Now that teaches us something very important as well. Just because you're not perfect doesn't mean you can't do some good.
And
Just because you're not perfect doesn't mean you can't do some good. And just because you didn't do right earlier doesn't mean you shouldn't do right now. That's a terribly important moral lesson. It's a terribly important political lesson that we have to learn again and again and again. And that's what makes the Bulgarian case so unique.
And that's the point of this conference and all the talking. Admitting our sins, we're actually getting knowledge about the two faces.
The only way to change is to, I'm a student of Jewish theology. Maimonides said there are three ways to achieve change. You have to understand what you have done, you have to admit to what you have done, and you have to make a resolution for the future, not to do it again. This conference is very important because it is a public admission on the part of Bulgarian intellectual leaders of the responsibility of Bulgaria during World War II. It then allows them to find something that they can use from this past. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Something that they can use from the past to contribute to the Bulgarian future.
Where do you think must start the process of facing the past and making it a real, speaking a real changing in our attitude to past? In politicals, in civil society, where?
It has to begin school systems. It has to begin media, school systems, teaching of history, writing of history, and then it will marshal up to the politicians.
Do you think that politicians can really put obstacles to such research in our past, or if we have will, they won't impede
Politicians can put obstacles to many things. Politicians have to be overcome with will.
And we must do this without excuses.
And we must do it without excuses, and we also have to begin with the young people.